Welcome to Profit's Healthcare Transformers podcast, where we'll be talking to leaders in healthcare who are focused on transforming their organizations to drive the next level of growth for their business and for healthcare. Hosted by Priya Anasia, Lindsay Mosby, Paul Schrimpf, and Jeff Gorgie. Transformation is one of those terms that has a lot of layers to it. Sometimes it's about innovation. Sometimes it's about shifting the way you do business. Sometimes it's to your overall operating model. And other times it's to a specific department or function. It's also about people, helping them navigate the discomfort that comes with change, but also motivating them to engage in the journey of transformation from the CEO to the newest employee. It's a journey, and that's why we created this podcast, to break down this multidimensional, dynamic topic of transformation, one story at a time. Are you ready to dive in?
Hi, I'm Paul Schrimpf, your host for this episode. Today we have the fabulous Ed Marx, and I don't even know where to describe him. You're Army medic, longtime CIO of multiple successful health systems, host of podcast Digital Voices. Ed, welcome.
Paul, thanks for having me. I've known you vis-a-vis the industry for a long time, so really excited to join you and chat all things, transformation and leadership.
That's great. That's great. And then I would love just to start with, I know I kind of give a little bit of a preview of your background, but would love to get the 5-minute Ed as best you can describe it.
Yeah. So I was born and raised in Germany. In fact, I just came back from Bavaria, where I'm from, southern Germany, and had a lower income sort of lower income class growing up experience. Came to the United States when I was 10, did the typical things, I suppose, you do in your youth, junior high and high school. But in high school, I had this pretty interesting experience. I got my first sort of like hourly job as a janitor in a healthcare system on a Peterson Air Force Base medical clinic. And so my job was to, after hours in the clinic, clean, basically mop floors, sweep floors, empty trash, dust. And man, something just connected with me, Paul, even though I was wearing, at the time it was Sony Walkman, and I was like blasting Black Sabbath or something. There was a connection. I was like, man, I'm called to healthcare. As a 16-year-old, I didn't really know what that meant, but I just knew healthcare was important to my future. At the same time, my mom was always sick, in and out of hospitals. And so I just sort of had this connection, like I want to help people, things like that. So anyways, I did that janitor thing for a couple of years. And then when I went to college, I needed money. Again, we grew up low income class. And so I got a offer from the Army Reserve to be a combat medic. And so I jumped at the chance, and that helped pay for my college. And again, it just reinforced this, man, I want to be in healthcare. I know I'm not a doctor. I didn't do too well in school. And so I knew that wasn't going to happen, but I just wanted to do something. Anyways, I did graduate and I became an Army officer, but I still had this draw towards healthcare. So there was a local hospital in Fort Collins, Colorado, tried to get a job there, but I was either overeducated, by this time I had a master's, or didn't have any experience. So I was like, oh my gosh, what do I do? Well, finally a job opened up as an anesthesia tech. It was a part-time, like a 6-week gig. And so I jumped at the chance. I leveraged my combat medic, experience, and they hired me. And then I was like, oh my gosh, this is really it. This is what I'm called to do. I've got to explore this. And so I did that for a couple of months. The person came back that I had displaced, off medical leave, but they created a computer project manager job for me in the OR. So I operated OR IT, which again, I had no experience, but they liked me or whatever. And I knew how to use a mouse. I don't even remember how it all came out. But anyways, from that moved me into a salaried position, eventually in strategy. And then our first daughter was born. It was like really scary. We were still in our 20s, and she was born without life, floppy. It was really bad. And it's like she was going to die. We didn't know. And my wife was still in the hospital because she had all this trauma from the situation. I was like, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? And it's like, oh my gosh, it just occurred to me that the IT department, I'd been helping them marketing with this great new tool that they had that you could dial in to the EHR, and you could be wherever. You could be at home or at a party and dial in as long as you had a modem, and you could see results and things like that. And I was like, oh my gosh, what if we sent a tech down to Denver Children's Hospital, set them up with that software? The NICU docs there could then consult directly on the phone and look at real time at results with our docs, where we were. And that's what we ended up doing. Our daughter, her life was saved. She went on to graduate from college at age 18. And it was at that moment I knew, oh my gosh, I am called to healthcare IT to help save lives. And I've been fortunate since then, Paul, to work with great organizations and great people that help me, because I'm pretty average. And I worked with above average people, and it just led to this career.
That's amazing. That's amazing. As a fellow NICU parent, I guess is what we're called. It is an interesting window in that stage, and the connectedness is very important. The next question we normally ask is what's not on your LinkedIn profile, but there's almost nothing that is not on your LinkedIn profile. But I'm going to steal your questions from your podcast and flip them back to you. What's on your playlist?
Yeah. So I've got my U2 shirt on. So I've always got U2 going. And lately, though, because I did just come back from Bavaria, it was all Sound of Music. So while we were traveling, on the Autobahn at 200 kilometers per hour, we were all singing. I was with some of my sisters and my dad, and we were all singing the soundtrack to Sound of Music. And then we tried to reimagine Sound of Music while we were up in the Bavarian Alps, singing and stuff like that. So if you look right now, the last couple songs, and one final one, because I have to say this, Paul, to pull a plug for one of my kids, is this guy named Bailey Zimmerman. He's a country artist, the hottest country artist right now. And my son wrote all of his songs and is his producer. So he's like the number one country music producer in the world right now. So Bailey Zimmerman's on my playlist too. I actually don't like country music, but when your kid is producing it, you got to listen to it. So
it grows on you. It grows on you. As a sideline country music fan, I'd say it grows on you. Another one of your favorite questions is what's your purpose? What's your life mantra?
I have two, one related to career and one's more personal, although the two do intersect. But on the career side, it's to save lives. I've experienced, you have, in the NICU, you've seen how technology can save people's lives. And so I've seen it over and over again throughout my career. And so that's what gets me pumped up. And of course, create great experiences for people. Not everyone needs their lives saved. So, we do wellness, all that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, man, we can save people's lives doing the work that we do. So that's it on the professional side. And on the personal side, again, they're not opposed to each other. It's really that in any interaction I have that, not to get overly spiritual on you, but any interaction I have that people would see that maybe there's a greater spiritual being in our lives than just what you see in the flesh. And so I hope not to trip people up, but to motivate them to see that there's a spiritual side to life as well.
That's great. That's fantastic. Thanks for sharing that. And as we kind of transition into the topic of transformation, you've been at some very interesting roles during very interesting chapters of an organization's growth, life, whatever you want to call it. As we think about the topic of transformation, what are some of the misnomers that you believe are out there when people talk about transformation?
Yeah, well, one is I think they believe that when you have a plan, which is important, I'm a big into planning, that it's going to happen. And that's just not the case. So they'll spend millions and millions of dollars. Kind of funny because I've seen it even in my own organizations. We'll spend millions of dollars on these great consulting firms and think, oh, okay, now we'll have transformation, and you don't. So that's one. The second one is by titling someone with Chief Transformation Officer or even if it's an informal role, that it's going to happen and that everyone's going to coalesce around them. So I was in an organization where I was leading digital strategy for a very complex global organization. But just because you have the title or given that mantle, organizations are very complex and it doesn't mean everyone's going to follow. So those are two that come to the top of my head. That's
an important takeaway. I've learned there's a lot of organizations that just want to hire a function or hire consultants. And when the consultants are gone, we're all done. And if the organization's DNA doesn't change, nothing really happens out of it. I kind of equate it to like ethics. Like you don't have like a chief ethics officer, only one person's in charge of ethics. It's just over there. If it's not getting woven into the organization, it really is struggles to take shape.
We studied this extensively. I was fortunate to author or co-author a couple of books. And one of them where we looked at transformation specifically, we found no difference if you had a formally titled Chief Patient Experience Officer or not. The outcome was the same. It really had to do with the culture of the organization. So I'm not saying it's bad to have a patient experience officer, but you don't have to have one. And just because you have one doesn't mean it's going to happen.
Yeah, no, totally agree. And it's how it's kind of baked in and connected in. We see that with, you mentioned patient experience. We're now seeing that with chief equity or health equity officers, things of that nature. Like if you're not doing something systematically, it's just a celebrity.
Yeah, I'm always like, I want to be a doer. And then, that's kind of what's driven me in my career and it has enabled success. Because I told you I'm pretty average and I really am. But I'm a doer. So I didn't just like pontificate or wait for a title or a special crowning moment. You just do. And when you do, transformation happens. If you sit around and pontificate and strategize, and only strategize and never execute, you never get the results. That's why we talk of digital transformation, at least for our entire career, and it really hasn't happened in a big way.
Yeah, no, agree. And then as we go to the other side, what do you think are some of the quintessential elements of successful transformation, either getting one started or executing it?
Yeah, I think number one, stealing a phrase from, I mentioned I was an Army officer. So we had these 9 principles of war, and Sun Tzu and others also talk about this, and Bismarck, is unity of command. So again, you can say, Ed, you're going to lead digital transformation, or whoever. Everyone has to unify behind that person. And what you find in organizations is everyone's got their own thing, and it requires humility. So the answer is humility. So if I'm out there and I say, I'm in charge, CEO said I'm in charge, you need to do what I say, it's not going to work. And at the same time, if someone else is put in charge, I need to respectfully challenge that person to get better ideas and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, I'm going to follow that person's lead. They've been appointed, I've been part of it. So it requires humility. And oftentimes, because you are encroaching, when you do transformation across a complex organization, you're encroaching every area: HR, finance, supply chain, operations, clinical, everything. And so it really requires this level of humility to say, hey, I need your help. Let's do this together. But oftentimes we don't get that. So that's probably the number one thing, is just humility and unity of command.
Yeah, no, those are good call outs. I think that's a big takeaway of what I've seen, as well as transformation requires change. And there's a lot of people in the organization that didn't come to an organization to change. And I've often seen halfway through transformations going, this isn't the job I wanted to take. You guys are moving the organization. If you don't have people excited or at least aware of what's going on, and to your point, a little bit of humility, like we don't know what we're doing and we're all having to do something different. But if you're not believing in the transformation, where it's going and how you fit into it, you get that disengagement going, that's not why I came here. And you get really some sour energy out of people. Yeah.
Yeah. And the other thing too, you talked about it already, change, but it was so eye-opening. When I first became a CIO many years ago, and it was at university hospitals, I decided to meet every employee in IT, but I didn't want them to come to my office. I literally went, I took a couple of days, went to everyone's cube or office, whatever their environment was. And what shocked me, because I was sort of new to IT, what shocked me was that I entered the era of which they graduated. Meaning, if they had graduated in the 1970s, when I went to their cube, and this was this would have been early 2000s. When I went into their cube, it was still 1970s. The technology was still 1970s. I always expected in IT, especially, that people would always be the first to have iPhones. That was another thing, so advanced, into maybe 10 years ago, like at Texas Health. And all of a sudden, everyone started showing up with iPhones and iPads, except for IT. I was like, wait a second, we're supposed to be leading this. And then I realized, it took me about 10 years to figure it out, but I realized that people were comfortable. And change, why change? I got this great job. I just do the same thing every day. And so so it's the realization that not everyone is like you, always like looking for the next thing. Like how can we leverage this to save lives? They just are happy doing what they're doing. So it requires extraordinary leadership to move people off the change.
That's incredibly important. I think we sometimes get caught up, particularly in rooms of leaders, because they're self-selected as ambitious people for the organization, for themselves. But there's a lot of people out there that want to go to work, do a good job, and go home. And this idea of growth or disruption is not something that they're chasing. I just had a conversation with a practice manager at a small specialty practice yesterday. And she's like, we don't have an EMR. We have no desire to get an EMR. Well, why not? Like, we've got more patients than we can serve. We're plenty busy. Why would I change? It's just like, well, good point. If you're a small independent practice and you're not trying to grow or, raise capital or promote people or pay off lenders,
right?
Sure, go right ahead. But we forget that, because in a room of high-powered executives and tossing consultants, we're like, well, we've got to grow and we've got to change. And we've got to make things better. There's a good chunk of the organizations that's just fine going to work every day and getting a paycheck and actually doesn't want to change at all.
Right. Yeah. So really, you have to double down as a leader to help people in that process and show them the why. This is why I want to change, because I want to save people's lives or whatever it might be, increase the wellness of the community. And you got to develop that empathy, help people with empathy and understand.
Yeah. And you mentioned kind of the 80s and 90s. If you could kind of go back and tell yourself one thing back in that chapter of your life, what advice would you give yourself?
Yikes. I would say to embrace the mantle of authority that's given to you. So I struggled with that earlier in my career. I was given the authority, but lacked the confidence to wear that mantle. So I recall when I first became CIO, again, going back to university hospitals in the early 2000s, I had the authority to do certain things, but for one reason or another, insecurities, I'm new, a lot of different reasons, and I didn't walk in my authority. So if I could go back to my, 20 or 30-year-old self, it'd be walking your authority. It was the same as an Army officer. I was a combat medic first, so I was this private. So literally, I was in a reserve unit where everyone knew me as, hey, they call me Doc, right? Because I was a medic. But I was really like a private first class Marx. One day I show up as Cadet Marx because now I'm in ROTC and I'm officially a cadet. And now I'm leading a platoon. And it was hard for me. It was hard for them. And it was all that authority. So it took me about a year. So finally, this major set me down. And it was like, Cadet Marx, you need to operate in the authority that's been granted to you by the United States federal government, the Army. And so I did. I was helpful from a spiritual side as well. And I was like, oh, I need to do this. But I had to be reminded of that multiple times in my career, actually. So that's probably the one thing I would say to myself is embrace the mantle of authority that's given to you.
That's great. And then you also brought up a topic that we haven't spoke about specifically on this podcast series, but this learning vector of leadership. So much of us, like we think about our early formal education, it's accounting, it's marketing, it's finance. We don't take executive demeanor in college. We don't understand that. So we're always learning. And I found fascinating that the best leaders are constantly learning leadership.
Yes.
And those skills are incredibly important at transformation because when there's doubt in leadership, and we're all uncomfortable. That's the funny thing I'm learning in the last 2 or 3 years. Almost all great leaders have high anxiety and think they're failing at any given time. It's making me more comfortable with my anxiety. But the idea of knowing what leadership is, knowing what your leadership profile is, what your skills are. But I'm seeing a lot of that in your story as well, if that's a fair summation.
Yeah, you have to always be in learning mode. And I almost take it like, hey, if you don't continuously learn and try to up your game and capabilities, someone will pass you. And maybe that's okay. Maybe you're okay with that. But I never was. I was like, I want to be, I was very driven. I was like, I want to be the CIO of the Cleveland Clinic. Okay. So I was always working on all the things for leadership and teamwork and various aspects of that because I knew a lot of people wanted to be CIO of Cleveland Clinic, and it doesn't have to be Cleveland Clinic, right? It could be any organization that you aspire to lead. So you had to do that. It's like, I played a lot of competitive sports growing up, and it was the same thing. I wasn't naturally gifted. I played a lot of soccer. I wasn't naturally gifted to play soccer as gifted as some other people, but I had this ambition and this drive and this vision and this passion. And I knew I had to work harder than others in order to achieve the success that I ended up achieving. And so I bring that same mindset into the workplace. And so always learning. Plus, it's kind of fun. You don't want to be stagnant. You want to be in a continuous learning mode.
That's what I've learned is just the change brings variety. It kind of adds energy. It kind of refreshes the soul, so to speak. But I really agree with that completely. On the role of CIO, and you mentioned this about the phone pieces, I find it interesting that the CIO in most health systems tend to be defaulting as the head of innovation or head of digital, which I find fascinating that in other industries, it's not necessarily correlated. Innovation and digital are not necessarily with the CIO, but it seems within health systems, there's a higher correlation of that. And I would love your thoughts on why.
Yeah. Now you're going to get me in a little trouble with some of my friends and colleagues. But, I think the traditional CIO is part of the reason why we haven't transformed as much as we should have in healthcare. Okay. So I've always been a big believer in, that's why I was always part of Chime boot camps and helping CIOs sort of transition from, we would call it 1.0 to 2.0. I call it the postmodern CIO, who's really strategic and I always say to be innovative, you must be innovative. You start asking people to lead innovation or transformation that are not innovative or transformative. And it always made me scratch my head. Like, this is an older example, but it's still actually a relevant one today. So you'd see people or CIOs and you'd see them at the airport and they have a paper boarding pass. I'm like, what the heck are you doing with a paper boarding pass? You need to be thinking, oh, wow, they've digitized a lot of this and transformed this. And I don't even have to go to the front counter anymore. And I can print my own bag tags. How might this work in healthcare? I need to be leading this. And so it just blew my mind. And so you have some of that still today. And yeah, it's weird. Different organizations are different, but some are realizing that while their CIO is great at doing CIO things, they may not be the best person to do digital transformation or digital officer. Some are. So, I would never take anything away for those that are doing well. Some have made that change to 2.0 to 3.0, or what I call, again, the postmodern CIO, but many haven't. So you are seeing some organizations go external, bringing in people from Disney or, some other consumer goods or finance, other industries that might be more advanced and making a big difference. And then I think it's a lot for one person. I was doing both where I came from. My last CIO gig, I was digital, I was CIO, and I had the pressure of just running IT.
Right.
But I wanted to really focus on the digital transformation, but I still had to focus, it was a tricky balance. So it's a hard thing to be in operations and at the same time be very strategic and trying to get transformation to happen. So I can see, Paul, to your point, sometimes it might be best suited to be in a separate role.
No, that's a very good takeaway. I think we all know people like are on the spectrum. You've got some CEOs out there that are really pushing the edge of what we're doing in healthcare. And then we've got the other ones that I call our HIPAA police. We can't do that because of HIPAA. I'm like, well, how did health information portability get conflated with anti-innovation? Is these tensions.
Exactly.
Well, awesome. I don't want to wrap up before we talk about your new role at Divurgent. Tell me more about this organization, what you guys are doing, and what's getting you excited for the coming years.
Yeah, I'm really excited about it. I'm a big planner and have a strategy for my career, and it never included becoming CEO of an advisory consulting services firm. And so I wasn't really looking for it. It's just kind of happened. I had a friend who's in a recruiting business, and they're like, Ed, we're looking for someone. And I was like, wow, I can't blame anyone anymore. If I'm the CEO, today you can blame, if you're not the CEO, you can always, the CEO, if I were CEO, I'd do this. And certainly I fell into that trap sometimes. I'd be like, if I were CEO, I'd do that. Well, now I am. So it's like, now I can be, and I can't use that excuse anymore. So the buck stops here, sort of thing. So then it was like, well, I want to learn more about Divurgent. I had heard of them before. And so I wanted to learn more. And I was like, wow, that's great company culture. And they really did. Everyone talks about company culture, but rarely do they live it, but they actually lived it and all kind of stuff. And the owners are great. And the people I met were great. So anyways, I ended up taking a bit of a risk, as they did, and coming there. And what's really exciting is that we have pivoted Divurgent now to be that partner that you as a CIO or CDO or CTO would want to partner with. So I took all the things that I always had angst with when I met with a vendor, showing me 30 slides or talking all the time, or, I would always sit there on the other side saying, if you did maybe 2 slides, or if you did maybe this, or talk about partnership, or listened more. So we pivoted the company to be like what a CIO might want to work, who they might want to work with. So that's huge. And then we've really expanded the breadth and depth of our capabilities. So we always had these capabilities, but we never sort of shined about them. We never branded them. And so we've entered into a lot of different new areas. Again, new in that we're highlighting them. We've done them, but now in a bigger way. So really including, human-centered design type capabilities, which I'm really thrilled about. I think that's what's missing from a lot of digital transformation. So it's a really exciting time. We're hiring a lot of people and just lifting up our game overall. I mean, we call it strength into strength. We're already a strong company. And so we're building on that strength and adding more strengths. And it's kind of a super exciting time to see it all pan out and work.
That's great. That's great. Yeah, watch out. The world of consulting, if you've got the right organization, it can be addicting. I came to Profit with the thought saying, I'll try consulting out for a couple years. And that was 16 years ago. So glad you're at a great spot. And then as we close, just as we think about, a lot of peers will be kind of listening to this podcast, but what advice would you have for peers of yours, kind of either leading transformation, helping others with transformation, et cetera?
Yeah, well, I think one that might be a little different is to, especially if it's peers who are maybe a little bit further along in their careers, is to serve on a board and serve on multiple boards. And so not only serve on not-for-profit boards where you could just help and bring insights. But I've had this fabulous experience recently, Paul, where I've been serving on the board for Summa Health System. So it's the first time I've been on a health system board. It's a pretty big system. That has been super insightful. I got to work. One of the fellow board members is someone I looked up to. When I was this really young CIO, he was the COO of the health system. And I was just like always in awe. And here I am now, sort of a peer with him in a way. And so it's fascinating to see how a health system works from the board level. It's an education. We talked earlier about leadership. So I've been learning so much from the CEO, who's like queens bees, whatever the phrase is. I mean, he's awesome. And then medical staff leadership. I've just been learning so much. So that's a way to learn something brand new, different areas, is serve on boards. You're giving back and you're making a difference, helping save lives. It's just, and then plus you're educating yourself so that you can help more people. That's one piece of advice. And again, going back to humility, it's like, man, it's not about yourself. You've got to surround yourself with great teams and great organizations and think of yourself as a servant. Like, I'm here to serve Divurgent, the people of Divurgent. I'm here to serve these health systems that we partner with. So if you could take that mindset, I think you'll go a lot farther.
That's great. That was really great advice. I do agree with the board pieces. I've gotten a lot from my board roles. There's something about overseeing an entire enterprise, or at least the conversations around that, because in any given week, month, or quarter, there's something that needs to be addressed. Rarely have I walked into a board meeting going, oh, that was an easy quarter, and this next quarter looks really easy. Like, it's never that way. And it shifts your perception no matter who you are in the organization when you know the whole ecosystem of what's going on with the business at any given time.
Totally.
I agree with that. Ed, thank you so much again for taking some time to share your story. Really appreciate it.
Paul, thanks for having me. It's such an honor.
Awesome. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to Prophet's Healthcare Transformers podcast. This podcast is produced by Jared Johnson and his wonderful team at Shift Forward Health. And a big thank you to our hosts, Priya and Asia, Lindsay Mosby, Paul Schrimpf, and Jeff Gorgie. If you liked today's episode, you can find more great content like this at prophet.com/thinking. I'm Anna Kuno, the senior editor of this podcast. Thank you for listening.